going to show you how to make a reversible quilt, and I'm going to be using Kreative Kiwi's Fancy Frames design for this. I'm using an 8x8 hoop. I've got my fabrics, which the front fabric is from Moda Layer Cake, and that's 10 inches by 10 inches. I've got my backing fabric cut to exactly the same size, and my batting is cut an inch bigger than my hoop size, so that will be 9 by 9. I've got some masking tape that I'll be used to securing it in the hoop, my squizzers, and I've got 2 lots of thread with a matching bobbin. I'm going to be showing you how to make inbuilt sashing, so we're going to be using two different sizes of the design to achieve this. And as always, there will be the links in the video description below, along with lots of other information for you, and a discount code for sim threads that you can use again and again and again until the 8th of February next year. A little bit about the files that I'm using. I've chosen the 8x8 frame number 7 coaster and the 6x6 frame number 7 quilt block for this. We're not going to be using the actual quilting in the 8x8 block. We're just going to be using it for securing our fabrics, and then we will switch to the 6x6 block for the actual design on the fabric. So I've got the 8x8 coaster loaded into my machine, and we're going to be stitching rounds 1, 4 and then 1 again for this. So load the file into your machine, hoop 2 layers of wash away stabilizer. You can use cutaway if you want, but you will have to trim it back. It's much easier with wash away. And then you're going to pop your hoop into your machine and stitch round number 1. You want a thread that matches your backing fabric for this, so because we want it to become invisible later on. Place your batting over the outline. Sorry, mine's covered in bits of fluff here. And then tape it in place. Staying with the 8x8 coaster file, you're now going to stitch round number 4. And the reason why I've chosen round number 4 is because it's going to stitch, secure the fabric in place, but slightly inside of this line. And that makes it easier later when we come to piecing the quilt together for sewing. So once you've secured your batting to the hoop, pop it in your machine and stitch round number 4. You're now going to trim away all the excess batting from around the edge. Turn your hoop over, and you're now going to place your backing fabric over the outline. You do want to make sure that you get this square. It's going to be important for when we come to joining it all together, because it's the excess on the backing that's going to give us our sashing. So take the time to line it up. And when you're happy, tape it in place. Turn your hoop over, and you're going to place your centre fabric, or your front fabric should I say, in the centre of your hoop. It doesn't matter about this one as to how it's lined up, as long as it covers the batting, that's all that matters. And then we're going to take this in place as well. To secure these fabrics, we're going to go back to round number 1 and stitch that, and make sure that you've got a matching bobbin and thread in your machine that matches your backing fabric. I'll show you later on why it's important, but for now just take my word for it. We're now going to stitch the motif design in the middle of this block. So I've loaded the 6x6 design into my machine. If you're doing this on a smaller hoop, say a 6x6 hoop, you would use the 6x6 coaster for your main block, and you would use the 4x4 as the centre. I've changed my matching bobbin and thread to gold, and we're now going to stitch the one and only round, and that's going to do the motif. You're now going to trim up the excess fabric from around the outer stitch line here. Make sure that you don't cut the stitching. And you can now free this from your hoop. So I'm just going to place my hand underneath just so that I don't catch this fabric. I need to keep that intact. So I'm just going to hold my hand underneath and then trim around to free it. And that's our block completed. You need to make as many of these as you need for the size quilt that you're going to make. I'm going to be doing a little lap quilt, or one that you can put on the floor to put a baby on with this. So there's only going to be 9 blocks to this, and they're all done in exactly the same way. Next I'm going to show you how to piece them all together and to create the sashing. Before you go any further, you're going to want to press these edges over on your quilt blocks. So just fold it halfway and then press, and do that on all 4 sides of your blocks. If you're using a really hot iron because your fabric is cotton like mine is, be careful if you're using poly fleece or any fibre non-cotton batting that you don't melt it. We're now going to join our blocks together, and we're going to work in rows, and then we will then join all the rows together into columns. So take your 2 quilt blocks and you're going to put them wrong sides together, and then you're going to pin them. Now make sure that you align them properly. What I do is I take a pin, I put it in the very corner of the stitch line, and then I do the same here. You'll have to excuse me, I'm a bit slow because I can't see what I'm doing. Then you're going to bring it up, or should I say, I push it down through there, and you can see that just by stabbing at it like that, it's not aligned. So I'm just going to pull the pin out and make sure that it goes through the stitch line of my second block. It's very difficult to do it on camera, I'm afraid, so forgive my fumblings. That's not too bad. So I do the 2 corners and then I do in the middle. fine. And the middle one. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same the other side with another block. Please bear with me with this because it is it's rather difficult when you can't see. And I will make sure that these are all nicely lined up before I actually stitch them in place. Okay, that's as good as it's going to get. Once I've done that, I then take some pins and I put them in the opposite way. And I'll be removing these and I'll explain why in a minute. And now I can remove these ones here. This way, so that when I come to sew this on my machine, I can just carry on stitching down. And I can actually stitch over my pins this way. I slow down, of course, so that I don't catch the pin itself, but it does make it a lot easier and a lot quicker to sew it. And I'm going to do exactly the same on this block here. And now my row is ready to stitch. And what you're going to do, you're going to stitch just inside this stitch line here, just a hair's width inside, so that when your block opens out, you're not going to see this stitching on the back. As you can see, I've done this in orange so you can see what I'm talking about. If you don't go over far enough, it only needs to be a little bit, you'll have orange stitching showing if you used a different colour bobbin. Whereas you can see on this it's blue. If it shows through a little bit, you're not going to see it. Okay, let's get on and stitch this. Okay, that's our 3 blocks joined. You're now going to take this piece, or the, should I say, the 2 backing pieces that stick up, and we're going to cut out a little square here. We don't want to go past this stitch line here, or obviously cut into this one here. So we're just going to take out a little bit, and it's purely to reduce the bulk when we come to folding it. So that one, I'm going to do the same here. And I will do exactly the same here and here as well. So once you've cut your little square out, you're then going to fold this over and fold it over again down onto your quilt block, and you're going to pin it in place. and then you will stitch down this line here just on the edge of this fold. Now I'm going to pin this one over. And stitch it in place along the edge there. So that's my 3 blocks joined. You're going to do exactly the same to however many blocks you want to join to form your strip, and then you're going to create more strips, and then we're going to get to the point where we want to join these together. So I've prepared 2 more here, and we're going to join this one and this one to this one. So exactly the same as before, we're going to put this with wrong sides together, or should I say the backs together, and then we're going to pin in the corners and line them up. The only difference is it's a lot longer now rather than short. So I'm going to pin that there. Take the time to align it properly, because it will make a difference to how your quilt turns out. Put a pin on the wrong side there, let's do it on this side. And try and align your sashing if at all possible, so that it all runs nicely from one to the next. When you're happy that it's all nicely aligned, you're now going to stitch along this stitch line here as you did for joining the blocks. So I've pinned the other strip to the middle one, and I'm now going to sew all the way along to join it. So now that all our pieces are joined, we're now going to work on the sashing, and as before when we did with the individual blocks, we're going to turn these over So turn them in half and then pin all the way along so that it looks like this. And then once again you're going to sew on along the edge there all the way along. Okay, so there's the two sides of the sashing all folded and pinned, and we're now going to stitch along the edge, along here and along here. Okay, so we're now going to do the same the other side. So I've rolled and pinned this side, and I'm just finishing off this side. And we're now going to stitch along here and all the way along here. And now the last one. We're now going to add our sashing and binding piece by piece. I've got two pieces here. One's going to be for the back and one's going to be the front of one of the sides, and that's going to be our sashing. We're going to work these one at a time. So I'm going to turn my quilt up here just so that I've got less in the way. You're going to place your sashing flat, and then you're going to line up this raw edge with this raw edge here. And you can pin it in place. You're now going to stitch that piece in place, and you're going to follow this stitch line here where your panels are, and we're going to stitch a hair's width inside that stitch line, so just this side, and then that will hide the edge stitch line of your panel. So now that's stitched on, I'm just going to fold this up a little bit. We've now got a stitch line that we can follow on the back when we put the front piece of sashing on, which is what we're going to do next. So place that up exactly the same as you did for the back, with the raw edge up against the raw edge, and pin it in place. Now I'm going to turn this over so that we're working from pinning from the back, because we're going to be stitching from this side. We're now going to stitch this on, and once more we're going to stitch a hair's width this side of the stitch line that you've just created by stitching your first piece of sashing on. So now that this is stitched, you want to press both sides upwards so that it sits nicely. And we're now going to do the opposite side to this. So I'm going to turn this round. And once more, we're going to place our fabric flat and then match this raw edge up to this raw edge. Always leave yourself plenty of waste, because it means that you can forget about the edges. Okay, so once more we're going to stitch a hair's width inside this stitch line here to this side, all the way along. So we're going to do the same as we did a minute ago. So I'm going to turn this over, lay my fabric flat, and offer up this raw edge to this raw edge. And then we're going to pin it in place. We're now going to stitch this in place by following this stitch line here, and we want to keep it just a hair's width this side of the stitch line. Before we go any further, we're going to add some batting between the front and back of each end. So I've got two pieces cut roughly to the same size as this here. You're just going to place it down in there, fold your fabric back, and then clip it in place or pin it, entirely up to you. Now we're going to do the same with the other end, so I'm just going to turn this around. And that's going to hold it for us until we've dealt with the sides. So now that we've done that, we can actually trim up level here, and it's going to trim our batting in with it. I've just turned my quilt so that the ends are on the side. I'm just going to remove this clip for a second. Lay my quilting rule up against this raw edge, and then I'm just going to take this off. now my clip can go back on. And I'm going to do the same with all the other edges. Okay, we're now going to add our sashing to the remaining two ends, and we're going to do it in exactly the same fashion as we did before. So lay your fabric flat and then match your raw edges up to your fabric and pin it in place. Now you're going to start stitching from here all the way to the end. If you're like me and your straight stitching is about as straight as a donkey's back leg, get your rule, line it up to your stitch lines of your quilt panels and just draw a line. We're now going to stitch this following your stitch line here, and that's going to be just inside the this side of that stitch line here. So we're now going to add the front piece. So remove our quilt a second. Lay the sashing strip down and line it up from the back, raw edge to raw edge. We're now going to stitch a hair's width this side of this stitch line. Just a little tip, if you wanted to prepare the two opposite sides together rather than going back and forth between your machine, you can do that, no problem at all. Then you can do all your pinning together and all your stitching for the opposite ends. And we're now going to do the last edge. And we're now going to stitch along here. Add your stitch line guide in if you want to here. Okay, so we're going to turn our quilt over towards the back, place our fabric down, and then line up this raw edge to this raw edge. And now we're going to stitch a hair's width this side of this stitch line here. So we're now going to add our batting, and we're going to do both ends at the same time, just to save a little bit of time. I've pressed my 2 pieces of sashing towards the top, and then we're going to lay down the batting between the 2 pieces. And pin them in place. We're now going to trim up all the way around the edges to make sure that they're the same depth on each side. So I've got my quilting ruler here, and I'm going to mark off from this stitch line here 7 centimetres above. So I'm going to put this on the 7 centimetre mark there and there. I'm just going to mark off 2 lines, one each end, and those 2 lines are what I'm going to align my bigger ruler to, so that I can cut it. So making sure that your pins are below this line, place your ruler on there. See, I've got one of my pin tips showing above there. And then you're going to cut. And we're now going to do exactly the same thing on the opposite side, and then the other 2 sides as well. Now for side number 3. And the last side. We're now going to draw in our quilting lines for around the edge of the sashing. I'm using double fold bias binding here, and it's 4 centimetres wide, which means when I've bound this quilt it's going to end up at 1 centimetre. So I want to, as this is 7 centimetres, I'm going to put my quilting lines every 2 centimetres, so that will give me 2 quilting lines, and then my binding. So I've measured from here along where my join is, sorry, and I'm going to mark off a 2 centimetre line. And then I'm going to do the same, another 2 centimetres up from the line that I've just drawn. And I'm going to repeat that on all 4 sides. Now that all my lines are drawn in, all that remains to do is to stitch all the way around, and I'm going to use a matching bobbin and thread, and it's going to be the same colour as my fabric. We're now going to bind the edge of our quilt with some bias binding. I've marked the centre with a clip here, and I'm going to open this out, and I'm going to leave myself a good 10-inch tail, and then I'm going to pin my binding to the edge of my quilt. And I'm just going to put some pins in along the way just to hold it. Until we get to the corner. Move this over so you can see what I'm doing. When we come to the corner, we're going to stitch along here, and then we're going to come off at a 45-degree angle, and we're going to fold our binding tape up at a 90-degree angle. And so that's our 45-degree. We come off there, fold that up, then we're going to fold this down. And then we will carry on stitching from here all the way down to the next corner, where we will stop just short of the end to come off at another 45-degree angle. And we're just going to go round the quilt doing that until we get back nearly to where we started. And I'm going to do this at the machine because it's a lot easier than keep coming away. And there's our 45-degree angle that we're going to come off at. Okay, so I've snipped my threads. So now I'm going to bring my bias binding up at a 90-degree angle to this piece here, and then I'm going to fold this part down so that it lines up with the top edge of the quilt. I'm just going to pop a pin in. Just to hold that while we get going. So now I'm going to start stitching from here until I get down to the next corner, where I'm going to do the same process again as I did here. I'm going to swivel it. So once again, fold our binding up 90 degrees and then bring it down vertically, taking the time to line this crease up with the top edge, of course. And just pop a pin in, just to hold it while you get going. Now we're going to stitch from here all the way down to the next corner, where we're going to come off at a 45-degree angle yet again. So fold your bias binding tape up and then fold it back down again, keeping the crease level with the top. And then pop a pin in. And you're now going to stitch as of here down to the next corner, and then you're going to come off at a 45-degree angle again. Okay, so we're now at the last corner and we're going to do exactly the same as we did before. So fold this back. And then back down again so that the fold is parallel to the edge. And pop a pin in. You're now going to stitch from here. We're not going to stitch all the way down. We're actually going to stop about 6 inches short of where we started. I'm just going to back tack here and finish off. Now that the first side of our bias binding is stitched, we now need to join these two ends, and we're going to join them on the diagonal. To do this is why you need long ends. What you're going to do is find the centre of your quilt, and then you're going to fold one of your pieces upwards, one of your tails upwards. Then you're going to bring this along here, like so, and fold your other tail downwards. And then finger press these creases in. So what we're actually going to do is stitch, and flip that up, along this crease line here, the two pieces together. Now it's not easy because of this laying flat, so what we tend to do is, let me just move these pins, pull that over so that it gives you more slack, and I'm just going to pin this over here. So our creases together, and then line them up, and then you're going to pin each side of that crease line. Okay, so now you're going to stitch along that crease line there, and then once that's all stitched, it will open out and you'll have a really neat join. I've still got my blue bobbin and threading, but I do advise you to use a colour that's going to blend with your bias binding tape. Now that this is stitched, we can remove all our pins. And there is your join. And we can now trim these tails up. Open up our quilt again, and now we can stitch all this into place. And before I stitch it, I would press that seam open because it's going to help to reduce any bulk. We're now going to work on the other side of our quilt, and we're going to bring the binding over, so it's still doubled over here, and you want this edge here to overlap the first line of stitching there, because we're going to stitch in the ditch from the other side, so we want the binding to be caught by our stitching. Now on one side you've got your nice 45-degree angle that folds one way, and I like to fold mine the opposite way, so I've got that one going that way and that one going that way, and that reduces any bulk on the corners and allows them to sit nice and evenly. The other thing that I do that probably a lot of people won't is I press my binding over, because it helps to hold it in place and you don't have to rely on so many pins to make it work. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to pin this up and then stitch in the ditch, which means that you're going to stitch on the right side of your quilt where the two fabrics meet. I've put a matching bobbin and thread into my machine to match the bias binding, and we're now going to stitch in the ditch all the way round and back to the start. And that's our reversible quilt finished. So there's the front. And there's the back. I hope you enjoyed this stitch along. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to be notified of new videos as they're published. Do pop along to Kreative Kiwi's Facebook group. There's lots of ideas, help and inspiration there for everybody. And thank you very much for joining me. There's a link to this design along with lots of other information in this video description.